December 1942, Cabanatuan, Luzon, Philippines. The air inside the administrative barracks was thick with humidity and ink. Lieutenant Takahashi Fumiko sat at her desk, sorting through intelligence reports from the prisoner of war camp outside. Through the slatted window, she could hear the shuffle of boots on gravel, the bark of guards, the low murmur of American voices. She had been trained to see the enemy as broken, defeated, stripped of honor, but then she heard it, laughter, not bitter, not hollow, full-throated, reckless laughter that spilled across the compound like water through a crack in stone. Fumiko set down her pen. She rose and moved to the window. Below, a group of American prisoners stood in the shade, their uniforms filthy, their bodies gaunt. One of them was smiling, not smirking, not grimacing, smiling, wide, open, fearless. Their eyes met. He did not look away, and in that moment, something inside Lieutenant Takahashi Fumiko began to fracture. When Japan entered the Second World War in December 1941, it did so with an empire built on discipline, sacrifice, and absolute obedience to the emperor. The military structure was rigid, hierarchical, and bound by a code that valued death over dishonor. Within this system, women occupied a carefully defined role, invisible yet essential. By 1942, as the war expanded across the Pacific, Japan faced a manpower crisis. Millions of men were deployed to front lines, stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. The void they left behind was filled quietly, methodically, by women. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were not sent to the front, but they were mobilized nonetheless into factories, hospitals, communication centers, and administrative offices within the military apparatus. Female officers, like Lieutenant Takahashi Fumiko, were recruited from educated families, trained in clerical work, intelligence sorting, translation, and medical assistance. They wore uniforms. They held rank. They worked inside the machinery of war, but their authority was carefully circumscribed. They were expected to serve without question, to embody the virtues of obedience and self-sacrifice that define the ideal Japanese woman under the wartime doctrine of Ryosari Kembo. Good wife, wise mother. These women were taught that loyalty to the nation transcended personal feeling. Emotion was weakness. Doubt was betrayal. The emperor's will was absolute, and to serve him, even in the silence of a supply depot or the shadows of a prison camp, was the highest calling. Fumiko had internalized this. She had been raised in a household where duty was not discussed. It was assumed. Her father had been a mid-level bureaucrat in the Ministry of War. Her brothers were officers in Manchuria. She had volunteered for service not out of ambition, but out of an unspoken understanding that this was what was expected of her. And now she sat in a humid office in the Philippines, surrounded by maps and prisoner locks, tasked with sorting through the wreckage of defeated men. The men she processed were Americans, survivors of battles that had shattered the Pacific in the first 6 months of the war. Bataan, Corregidor, Wake Island, names that had become synonymous with surrender, a word that, in the Japanese military lexicon, carried no honor, no dignity, only shame. When the American and Filipino forces on Bataan surrendered in April 1942, over 70,000 men fell into Japanese hands. They were marched north under a blazing sun, denied water, food, rest. Thousands died on the road. The survivors were herded into camps like Cabanatuan, O'Donnell, and Davao, makeshift prisons carved out of jungle and neglect. To the Japanese command, these men were not prisoners of war in the Western sense. They were contemptible. They had chosen life over death. They had raised the white flag under the Bushido Code that governed Japanese military conduct. Surrender was the ultimate disgrace. A soldier was expected to fight to the last breath, to take his own life other than submit to capture. To surrender was to forfeit one's humanity. This belief was not abstract. It shaped every interaction, every policy, every ounce of rations withheld. Japanese guards were told that the prisoners had dishonored themselves and deserved no mercy. Female officers like Fumiko working in administration and intelligence, were insulated from the worst of the violence, but they absorbed the ideology. They were told these men were weak, broken, less than human, and yet, when Fumiko looked at the reports crossing her desk, interrogation transcripts, medical records, incident logs, she found herself noticing something that did not fit the narrative. The Americans were not behaving like defeated men. They organized themselves into makeshift leadership structures. They shared rations. They cared for the sick. They told jokes. They sang songs. They defied orders in small, persistent ways that drove the guards to fury. And they smiled, not always, not constantly, but often enough that it began to disturb her. In Japanese culture, a smile in the presence of authority could mean deference, politeness, or submission. But the smiles she saw in the compound were different. They were direct, unflinching, almost insolent. The prisoners looked their captors in the eye and smiled as if they knew something the guards did not. As if they believed, against all evidence, that they would survive. Lieutenant Takahashi Fumiko had been shaped by a culture that venerated sacrifice. From childhood, she had been taught that the individual existed only as part of a collective, the family, the village, the nation, the emperor. Personal desire was selfish. Personal expression was dangerous. A proper Japanese woman did not assert herself. She supported. She endured. She disappeared into her role. When she entered military service, these principles were reinforced through ritual and routine. Every morning began with a recitation of the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. Every task, no matter how mundane, was framed as service to the divine mission of the empire. Fumiko sorted documents with the same reverence her mother had once prepared offerings at the family shrine. She had learned not to question, not to wonder, to accept the hierarchy as natural, the suffering of the prisoners as justified. They had surrendered. They had chosen shame. What happened to them was a consequence of their own weakness. And yet, when she walked past the wire fences and saw them standing in the sun, skeletal and exhausted, she sometimes felt a flicker of something she could not name. Not pity, exactly. Not sympathy. Something closer to confusion. They did not behave like men who had accepted their disgrace. For the American prisoners, defiance was not a strategy. It was a reflex, a way of holding on to the self when everything else had been stripped away. They had been trained to give only name, rank, and serial number. But beyond that, they had no manual for survival in a place like Kabinachuan, no precedent for starvation rations that amounted to a handful of rice and a cup of weak soup, no protocol for tropical disease, for guards who beat men for sport, for the slow erasure of identity that came with captivity. So they improvised. They created structure where none existed. They formed work details, medical committees, burial squads. They appointed leaders from among their own ranks, not officers, necessarily, but men who could hold the group together through humor, stubbornness, or sheer force of personality. And they smiled, not because they were happy, not because they were naive, but because a smile was a declaration. It said, "I am still here. I am still human. You have not broken me." Some prisoners smiled to diffuse tension, to signal camaraderie, to remind themselves that humor was a form of resistance. Others smiled because they refused to give their captors the satisfaction of seeing fear. The smile became a weapon, a small one, subtle, but unmistakable. Was the one thing the guards could not take. In Japan, the expression of emotion in public was carefully regulated. A smile could convey many things: politeness, embarrassment, even sadness, but it was never raw, never confrontational. To smile in the face of authority without deference was an act of rebellion. The American smile was different. It was open, direct, and utterly unguarded. It did not ask for permission. It did not soften itself for the comfort of others. It simply existed, bold and unapologetic. To Lieutenant Fumiko, this was incomprehensible. She had been taught that strength lay in restraint, in the ability to suppress the self in service of the whole. The Americans seemed to believe the opposite, that strength lay in asserting the self, in refusing to be erased, She watched them during roll call, during labor assignments, during the long, brutal hours under the tropical sun. They moved slowly, their bodies ravaged by dysentery and malaria, but they did not shuffle. They did not bow their heads in the way Japanese prisoners would have done. They stood as upright as their weakened frames allowed, and when a guard screamed at them in Japanese, some of them smiled, not in mockery, not in defiance, exactly, but as if to say, "I do not understand your words, but I understand that I am still alive." Fumiko began to notice the guards' reactions. At first, they responded with violence, a rifle butt to the ribs, a slap across the face, but the smiles did not stop, and over time, the violence began to feel hollow. The prisoners were being punished for something the guards could not define, could not control. The smile was a crack in the ideology. It suggested that dishonor was not universal, that surrender did not mean the end of self, that there were other ways to be strong. Fumiko's position as a female officer placed her in a strange twilight. She was part of the military hierarchy, but she was not a combatant. She held rank, but she could not give orders to male soldiers. She processed reports of violence, but she did not inflict it herself. This distance gave her a perspective that the male guards did not have. She was not invested in breaking the prisoners. She was not personally offended by their defiance. She simply observed, and what she observed disturbed her. The male guards treated the prisoners with contempt, but also with a kind of obsessive attention. They needed the prisoners to bow, to flinch, to acknowledge their defeat. When the prisoners refused, when they smiled instead, the guards became enraged. It was as if the prisoners' resilience was a personal insult, a challenge to the entire structure of meaning the guards had built their lives around. Fumiko wondered if the guards saw something in the prisoners that they feared in themselves. The possibility that surrender was not the end, that a man could lose everything and still remain whole. She thought of her brothers, stationed somewhere in China or the Pacific. She thought of what would happen if they were captured. Would they take their own lives, as they had been taught? Or would they, in the end, choose to survive? And if they chose to survive, would that make them weak? Or would it make them human? It happened on a Tuesday, 1943. Fumiko had been assigned to assist with a routine interrogation. The subject was a staff sergeant named Robert Coleman, captured during the fall of Bataan. He had been selected because intelligence reports suggested he had served in a communications unit, potentially valuable information about allied radio frequencies and encryption protocols. The interrogation room was small, windowless, thick with the smell of sweat and mildew. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. The lead interrogator was Captain Watanabe, a career intelligence officer fluent in English, known for his methodical approach. Fumiko's role was to take notes, to translate nuances if needed, to remain silent and invisible. Coleman was brought in by two guards. He moved slowly, his wrists bound, his frame emaciated. His uniform hung loose on his body. His face was gaunt, stubbled, marked by the dark hollows of malnutrition, but his eyes were alert. Watanabe began the questioning in English. Name, rank, unit, commanding officer. Coleman answered with the standard responses. Nothing more. Watanabe pressed harder, circling back to the radio equipment, the frequencies, the codes. Coleman repeated the same litany. Name, rank, serial number. The captain's voice grew colder. He stood, walked around the table, leaned close to Coleman's face. He spoke in Japanese, then turned to Fumiko and asked her to translate a threat. That Coleman's continued silence would result in severe consequences. That cooperation would earn him better treatment, better rations. Fumiko spoke the words in English, her voice flat, professional. Coleman looked at her for the first time, not at the captain, at her. And then he smiled, not broadly, not theatrically, just a small, slight curve at the corner of his mouth. His eyes met hers with a clarity that felt almost intimate, as if they were the only two people in the room. Fumiko stopped mid-sentence. The captain barked a question at her. Why had she paused? She stammered, finished the translation, but her hands were shaking. The pen felt strange in her grip, Coleman did not look away. The smile remained. It was not defiant. It was not mocking. It was something else entirely. It was kind. Captain Watanabe saw the exchange. His face darkened. He struck Coleman across the jaw with the back of his hand. The crack echoed in the small room. Coleman's head snapped to the side, but when he straightened, the smile had not entirely disappeared. It had simply softened into something quieter, something patient. The interrogation continued for another 20 minutes. Watanabe grew increasingly frustrated, his questions sharper, his threats more explicit. Coleman gave nothing. Eventually, the captain dismissed him with a wave of disgust. The guards hauled the sergeant to his feet and dragged him out. Fumiko sat in silence, staring at her notes. She had written nothing useful, just fragments of dialogue, repeated denials, the mechanical transcription of a conversation that had led nowhere. But the smile remained in her mind. That night, she could not sleep. She lay on her cot in the women's barracks, listening to the sounds of the camp, the hum of insects, the distant clang of metal, the low voices of guards changing shifts. She replayed the moment over and over. The way Coleman had looked at her, the absence of fear in his eyes, the smile that had not asked for anything, had not tried to manipulate or charm. It had simply existed. In Japanese culture, such directness from a prisoner would have been unthinkable. A captured Japanese soldier, if he had not already taken his own life, would bow his head in shame. He would avert his eyes. He would embody his disgrace. But Coleman had done the opposite. He had looked at her as if he was still a man with agency, with dignity, with the right to meet her gaze as an equal. It was not submission. It was not defiance. It was something Fumiko had no vocabulary for. Over the following weeks, she began to notice it everywhere. In the mess lines, where prisoners stood with tin cups and waited for their rations, some of them joked with each other in low voices. In the labor details, where men hauled lumber and dug trenches under armed guard, some of them hummed tunes she did not recognize. In the sick bay, where the dying lay on bamboo mats, some of them still managed to ask after their friends, to offer comfort, to smile weakly when a nurse approached. They were not pretending to be strong. They were not performing resilience for an audience. They simply refused to let their captivity define them. Fumiko found herself returning to the fence line during her breaks, watching from a distance. She told herself it was part of her duties, that she was gathering intelligence, observing behavior. But the truth was more complicated. She was beginning to see them not as defeated enemies, but as human beings. And that realization terrified her, because if they were human, if their smiles meant hope, if their laughter meant resistance, if their refusal to break meant strength, then everything she had been taught about honor and sacrifice and the rightness of the Empire's cause was built on a lie. And once that crack appeared, it could not be sealed. The war ground on. By late 1944, the tide had turned decisively against Japan. American forces advanced island by island, reclaiming territory, severing supply lines, pushing the Empire back toward its home islands. The prisoners at Cabanatuan knew it. The guards knew it. Even the officers in the administrative barracks knew it, though no one spoke of it aloud. In January 1945, American Rangers and Filipino guerrillas launched a daring raid on Cabanatuan. They breached the perimeter at nightfall, overwhelmed the guards, and evacuated over 500 prisoners in one of the most successful rescue operations of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Takahashi. Fumiko was not present that night. She had been transferred to a logistics post in Manila weeks earlier, but she heard about it through fragmented reports. The camp she had known was gone. The men she had watched, the faces she had memorized through months of silent observation, were free. She did not know if Staff Sergeant Robert Coleman was among them. She had no way of finding out. His name had been one among thousands. By August, Japan surrendered. The Emperor's voice crackled over radio speakers across the archipelago, announcing the unthinkable. The war was over. The divine mission had failed. Fumiko was in Manila when the American occupation forces arrived. She stood with other Japanese personnel at a crowded processing center, waiting to be questioned, classified, repatriated or detained. The Americans moved through the room with clipboards and interpreters, asking questions, taking names. She expected hostility. She expected retribution. Instead, the American officer who interviewed her was polite, almost gentle. He asked about her duties, her rank, her role in the camp. She answered truthfully, her voice barely audible. When he finished, he nodded, made a note on his clipboard, and thanked her. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He smiled, not unkindly. Then he moved on to the next person in line. Fumiko returned to Japan in late 1945, part of a mass repatriation of military personnel and civilians scattered across the former empire. She arrived in Yokohama on a cold November morning, stepping off a transport ship into a country she barely recognized. The cities were ash. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, vast stretches reduced to rubble by firebombing. Her family home in the suburbs of Tokyo had survived, but her father was gone, dead from illness during the final year of the war. Her brothers had not returned. One was confirmed killed in Okinawa, the other was missing, presumed dead in the Philippines. She moved back into the house with her mother and younger sister. They did not speak much. There was a silence in post-war Japan that was deeper than grief, a collective numbness, a paralysis born from the collapse of everything they had believed. The occupation forces were everywhere. American soldiers walked the streets, handed out rations, oversaw the dismantling of the military government. Fumiko avoided them when she could, but sometimes, in the markets or at the ration distribution centers, she would see them, young men in olive uniforms, laughing, smoking cigarettes, speaking in that loose, casual English that had once sounded so alien to her. And sometimes, they smiled at her. Not with cruelty, not with triumph, just the same open, fearless expression she had seen in the prison camp, as if the war had ended, and now there was only the work of rebuilding. As if enmity could be set aside as easily as a uniform, Fumiko could not reconcile it. In her mind, the Americans should have been vengeful. They had every right to be. But instead, they seemed almost indifferent to the ideology that had driven the war. They cared about roads, food distribution, restarting the economy. They cared about the future, not the past. She thought often of Staff Sergeant Coleman. She wondered if he had survived, if he had returned home, if he ever thought about the camp, the interrogation room. The moment their eyes had met. She wondered if he had smiled, because he knew, even then, that he would outlive the empire that had tried to break him. In 1952, Fumiko began working as a translator for an American trade company in Tokyo. The job was mundane, but it gave her a kind of quiet peace. She never spoke about her war service. She never sought out former colleagues or prisoners. She lived a small, careful life, but she never forgot the smile. There is a moment in every war when ideology meets the irreducible fact of another human being. When the propaganda dissolves and all that remains is eye contact, breath, presence. For Lieutenant Takahashi Fumiko, that moment came in a humid interrogation room in the spring of 1943, when a starving American sergeant looked at her and smiled. It was not a grand gesture. It did not change the course of the war. It did not save lives or alter strategies, but it cracked something open inside her, a question she could not unask, a doubt she could not suppress. The smile said, "I am still here. I am still myself. You cannot take that from me." And in a war built on the erasure of the self, on the subordination of the individual to the state, that simple act of assertion was revolutionary. Fumiko would carry it with her for the rest of her life, not as guilt, not as trauma, but as a quiet, persistent reminder that strength comes in forms she had never been taught to recognize, that honor is not the same as obedience, that survival is not the same as surrender, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon a human being possesses is the refusal to look away, and the courage to smile without fear.